And now I'm going to turn it over to Wendy to introduce our speaker.
Hi, our speaker today is Mark Jones, and his topic is the new administration. What can we expect in the first year? He's a fellow in political science at Baker Institute. He's also serves as the faculty director of Rice's Master of Global Affairs programs, and his work focuses on selectoral laws and other political institutions on governance, representation, public policy, and voting. He's also going to be part of something called an open Rice session on Wednesday, January 7th at noon, entitled From Trump to Biden, the Presidential Transition Process. So we all need to look at that because that sounds very interesting. So let's welcome him as our speaker.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Oh, I need to unmute it. Sorry. Okay, let me share the screen real quick. Okay, and there we go. Okay, can everybody see my screen? Thumbs up from somebody if they can. Thank you. Well, it's a pleasure being here today. Now, what I wanted to do is just go briefly over sort of how we got to where we're going by looking at national level results, Texas level results, then open it up for a small discussion of what's going on in the Texas legislative session. And then in questions, we can look at sort of the federal administration. Well, that's a little more uncertain right now. So let's go back to the sort of the pivotal event back on November 4th. That's when Joe Biden defeated Donald Trump by a substantial margin in the Electoral College and by almost 5% of the popular vote. The key states that flipped were Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Those are states that President Obama had won previously. Trump surprised everyone by winning those back in 2016. Biden won them back, in addition to flipping the longest time red states of Georgia and Arizona, which had been trending more Democratic over the past decade. So in the presidential vote, we still had some patterns that continued. For instance, among Anglos, Donald Trump still was the favorite. He won by 58% to 41%, 17 points over Biden. Among Latinos, it flipped the other way. Biden won among Latinos by 33%. But you can see also among Anglo women, and then those should actually be flipped. I'm sorry, those are wrong. It should men are Trump won 61%, Biden won 38%, and then it's 55% for women. Trump won among women and 4% among Biden. And then among African Americans, Biden handily won. But we still have pretty strong ethnic racial differences or cleavages in that Anglo vote is still very strongly Republican, African American vote strongly Democratic, Latino vote leaning Democratic, but not as much. When we go to Texas, we see a similar trend, but with a few differences. Republican support or Trump support among Anglos in Texas was much higher, or notably higher than at the national level. He won 66% of the Anglo vote, compared Biden won only 33%. And Trump did better among Latinos in Texas than at the national level, and certainly better than many people had expected. And then he won 40% of the Latino vote, where Biden won 59%. Overall, I'm sorry, I'll cover that. When we look at sort of Anglos in education, this is where you see a really big split. College-educated Anglos slightly favored Biden over Trump, but non-college educated Anglos favored Trump over Biden by a 2-to-1 margin, which is pretty substantial. Now, the Senate was sort of the main battle royale on November 4th. That was the race that everybody was focused on. Republicans came into the election with a 53-47 advantage. Democrats needed a net gain of 3 seats, along with winning the presidential election so that Kamala Harris would be vice president and cast the tie-breaking vote. They just narrowly obtained that via the 2 victories that they flipped in Georgia during the special election, in addition to the 2 seats they had already flipped in Colorado and Arizona. Republicans took back Alabama, which had been somewhat gifted by Republicans to Democrats when they nominated an unpalatable candidate, Roy Moore, who was defeated by Doug Jones. So now we have a 50-50 tie in the Senate, And with Kamala Harris casting the tie-breaking vote, at least the agenda power of the Senate is going to lie in Democratic hands, with Chuck Schumer now being the majority leader. The House was surprising for many people in the sense that, and I think especially this surprising for Nancy Pelosi, Democrats were relatively convinced that they were going to gain seats, not lose seats. So they were looking at a net gain. They were expecting somewhere between 10 and 15 seats. And in the end, Republicans ended up having a net gain of 11 seats. So Democrats didn't get the pickups that they had hoped to get. And as a result, the Democratic majority in the US House is much narrower than they had hoped for or expected, and makes it a lot more difficult for Nancy Pelosi in the sense that you need 218 seats to control. One still up in New York is still being decided in the longest recount I've ever seen, and highlights the inefficiencies of the New York voting and electoral system, but it should be decided by the end of this week. Democrats, though, now have a very narrow advantage. Especially, it's actually even a little narrower than this, because a couple of Democrats have been nominated to cabinet positions, and so they're going to have to hold special elections there. So in the end, the House has a very narrow Democratic majority, but it's one that's likely to stay through the tenure, at least for the next 2 years. So what we're looking at in DC is, for the first time, since Obama's first term, actually, well, in Trump, but we have a Democratic majority in all three branches, or essentially in the House, in the Senate, and in the presidency. So from Joe Biden's perspective, if he's going to get through legislation, odds are it'll be during these first 2 years, given the tendency of midterms to often be somewhat negative for the president. And that's especially going to be the case probably in 2022, unless Biden's very successful, because Republicans did a much better job in state legislatures across the country, and therefore Republicans will have a greater ability to craft or gerrymander House districts to benefit in favor of the Republican candidates rather than this case for the Democrats. So odds are this narrow majority the Democrats have, the most likely scenario right now is that Republicans will flip it going into 2022, especially given the control over redistricting, with Texas being the biggest prize, which we'll talk about in a second. So in Texas, Donald Trump won the election, but by the narrowest margin since Bob Dole defeated Bill Clinton back in 1996 with Ross Perot on the ticket on the ballot as an independent candidate. The other Republicans won by about 10%, slightly less, somewhere in the 9.5 to 10% range. People like John Cornyn over MJ Hager, Jim Wright over Krista Castaneda in the Railroad Commission race, and then all of the judges won by about 9% when there wasn't a libertarian candidate, and by about 10% when there was a libertarian candidate. It was pretty straightforward across the board. So overall, what these results demonstrated is that in spite of Democratic gains, Texas still remains a Republican state. That is, where sort of there's a natural Republican advantage of about 10 points. And certainly low quality Republican candidates or high quality Democrats candidates can narrow that margin, but that the Republicans start off every election season, at least with this advantage. So, one thing that we saw in Texas this fall, and why many people thought the race was going to be closer, was that the polls were not so accurate in terms of predicting the presidential race in Texas. So remember, Donald Trump won by, it's like 5.58%, or about 5.6%. Most of the polls had him either tied with Joe Biden, like the Emerson poll or Morning Consult, which came out days before the election, or Public Policy Polling, which had Biden winning by 2 points, or UMass Lowell, which had at 1%. The only two polls that came pretty close to the actual result were the New York Times Siena poll and the UH Hobby School poll. And I was involved as one of the principal investigators on that Hobby School poll. And we actually, of all the polls conducted in Texas, came the closest to the actual result. We had Trump winning by 5.3%. He ended up winning by 5.6%. Now, one of the things that everybody was watching in Texas this last cycle was Democratic attempts to flip about 10 House seats, and then Republicans attempt to flip 2 of them. In the end, nothing changed. So just in spite over $150 million being spent, actually probably about closer to 200 million, in the end, the balance was the same. You still had 13 Democrats and 23 Republicans representing Texas. The Republican who came closest to defeating a Democratic incumbent was Wesley Hunt here in Congressional District 7 in Houston, who came within 3.3% of defeating Lizzie Fletcher. And then Democrats Candace Valenzuela and Gina Ortiz-Jones came relatively close to defeating Tony Gonzalez and Beth Van Dyne in 2 open seats, 23, which is San Antonio, down to Eagle Pass, out to the lower El Paso Valley, and 24, which is up in the Metroplex. But on the other races, the Republicans won pretty comfortably, with people like Dan Crenshaw, who some expected to have, or Chip Roy or Troy Nails, who some people viewed as vulnerable, winning by reasonable margins. One thing that was also surprising for many was that Donald Trump did so well down in the Valley and Laredo. So Hidalgo and Cameron down in the RGV, and then Webb County over in Laredo. Trump improved his performance compared to 2016 by 11% to 15%. Now, one of the real focal points of this election, I'll go to this slide actually, was Democratic hopes of flipping the Texas House. So Democrats spent hundreds of millions of dollars with the goal of trying to flip the Texas House. Republicans came into this election with an 83 to 67 advantage. So Democrats needed a net gain of 12 seats to have a tie, 13 to have a win, or I'm saying 9 seats to have a tie or to win. And so their focus was on these seats that I have listed before you. These were the races that Democrats were spending a lot of money, recruited high quality candidates with the hope of winning. The result though was they only won 1 seat. So of all the ones targeted, the only Democrat who won was Ann Johnson, who defeated Sarah Davis in 134, which is where Rice is located. All of the other Democratic challengers lost. Now, the reason for that, in part, was that unlike 2018, when Republicans had lost 12 seats, in 2020, Republicans were ready for the Democratic challenge. That is, they weren't caught off guard. So particularly under the leadership of Greg Abbott, they spent a lot of money. They supported their candidates. They coordinated campaigns. They made sure that in places like 26, where they had an open seat, they recruited a strong candidate, J.C. Jatan, or in 138, these are both in the Houston area, Lacey Hull. So they had good quality candidates to run against the Democrat to defend the seat against the Democrats. And so they, not being caught off guard, they were able to protect these seats. They also went on the offense and spent quite a bit of money, both recruiting high quality candidates, who at point Will Douglas is one good example of that, Kerry Isaacs another, Luisa Del Rosales III, Mike Schofield. They recruited really strong candidates, and then they supported them with quite a bit of money. Now, only Schofield of these candidates won. He defeated Gina Kalani in West Houston. But in the end, these races tied a lot of Democratic dollars down and forced the Democrats to spend more money and time trying to protect these incumbents. So by the Republicans having a coordinated sort of a strategy, they were able to retain their 83 to 67 seat majority in the Texas House. And over in the Senate, lost 1 seat that the Democrats had gifted to them in a special election. So there we have a 18 to 13 split. Now, this is just one thing you can see where these are sort of how the candidates outperformed Donald Trump. One thing that was common is that all of the state Republican House candidates outperformed Donald Trump, in some cases by as high as 9% in the case of Sarah Davis, and in others as low as 0.9% with J.C. Jatan or 9.9% with Tony Tinderhill. But what was interesting, and I think was something that we knew was going to happen, was that Donald Trump was a real drag on the Republican ticket. That is, he underperformed every Republican. And so, and he tended to pull Republicans down rather than lift them up on average. Now, a third factor that was interesting in this election was this is the first election in Texas where we didn't use straight ticket voting. Now, straight ticket voting provides you with the option that when you come in, you don't have to go all the way through the ballot, which we know in Harris County can mean having to vote in 90 to 110 races. With straight ticket voting, you just check a box at the stop saying I vote for all the Democratic candidates or all the Republican candidates, and the computer automatically populates the field. You can then go through and change it if you want, but it makes it a lot easier for voters. So one fear that we had is that after we got rid of straight ticket voting, we would have an increase in what we call roll-off. That is people who don't complete the ballot. That is, they vote in the top races, president, Senate, Congress, but they don't make it down to the less well-known races. And really that fear wasn't realized in this election because the roll-off in 2016 was around 97% in most, 97 to 98% in most of these races. And in this election, it went from 96 up to like 97, 98. So it really, it was a slight roll off by about 1%, 0.5% on average, but nothing that was really overwhelming. So so in the end, Texas voters ended up going all the way down the ballot in a way that we didn't know if they were going to do. It was an open question, but in the end, we didn't see the level of roll off that might have occurred, or at least that was sort of the worst fear would occur. So let's think about Texas Democrats. So there's sort of two ways to look at the current status of Texas Democrats. There's a glass half full and a glass half empty. The glass half empty is the fact that in spite of spending record amounts of money, some great elections, a very unpopular Republican at the top of the ticket, they remain with 67 out of 167 out of 150 seats in the Texas House, 13 out of 31 seats in the Texas Senate, and 13 out of 36 seats in the U.S. House delegation, and neither of the senators. So that's sort of the glass half empty. The glass half full, though, is to say, okay, look at where Texas Democrats are now compared to where they were in 2014 or 2015. So 52 seats in the House to 67, 11 in the Senate to 13, 11 in the U.S. House to 13. And we also can see in cutting margins. So John Cornyn won his election in 2014 by 27%. He won it in 2020 by 10%. Mitt Romney won the election by 13% in 2012, Donald Trump by 6% in 2020. Ted Cruz won by 16% in 2012, won by 3% in 2018. And across the board, you can see in 2020, or in 2018, Greg Abbott won by 13%. He had won by 20% in 2014. Dan Patrick won by 19% in 2014. He won by 5% in 2018. So the numbers are narrowing somewhat. So if your point of comparison is 2018, then you would say Democrats didn't improve much. That is, they didn't really gain much from the base that they had established in 2018. So there were gains, but the party plateaued. But they also didn't go backwards. In 2020, they're much better off still than they were in 2016, let alone 2014, which was something of a nadir in the modern era. You can also see, that the numbers, particularly when we're looking at, say, the U.S. House, are not fully, but we see a 2-seat Democratic gain, but those aren't fully showing the strength of Democrats. So you can see, let's think of just in terms of funding. Democrat in 2014 and 2016, there was only one Democratic candidate running against a Republican that raised more than $1 million. That was Pete Geiger down in Congressional District 23. In 2018, there were only 4. In 2020, there were 9. So that shows higher quality candidates and greater fundraising. The Republican candidates won by more than 10% in 24 races in 2014 and 2016. They only won by 10% in 16 races in 2020. They'd run by 20% plus in 24 in 2014, 18 in 2016, now only 11. So you also saw Democrats closing the gaps, making elections more competitive, and forcing Republicans to really get out and work hard to campaign, something that they hadn't had to do in prior elections. And this is sort of just showing the changing sort of trends of demographics in Texas. What we're seeing in Texas is some counties that used to be light pink and red are now blue. That would be Harris County, which has gone from light pink to purple to blue. Fort Bend County, which is now blue, which used to be red. Hayes County, south of Austin, which used to be red and now is blue. And then countries like Williamson County and Bell County, which used to be darker red, are becoming lighter red. And the same is true with Denton County, Collin County, and Tarrant County. They're all becoming more competitive. So by and large, Republican strength tends to lie in the rural areas, which is a relatively small share of the state population, and in the suburban areas. But what we see are Democrats are making gains in urban areas and many of the suburban areas. And as a result, the Republican margins are more narrow. Republicans now are winning these statewide elections more than anything else, with outsized victories in cities like Tyler, Amarillo, Lubbock, San Angelo, and then still doing well in some of the suburban counties, places like Johnson and Ellis up in the Metroplex, or Montgomery County here in the Houston area.
Thank you for that. I see there's a question from Robert McKee. Would you like to ask your question, Robert? Unmute yourself, please.
Yes, I was curious whether the gains that the Democrats made in traditionally Republican states was largely attributable to Trump being at the top of the ticket, and whether that's something that the Democrats will be able to continue without having such a drag on the Republicans with Trump.
Well, yeah, I think Arizona and Georgia, I'd say Arizona and Colorado is probably gone. Cory Gardner was going to have a tough time there anyway, but Trump really hurt Martha McSally out in Arizona. And he hurt also the Georgia Republicans in part, well, both because his presence on the ticket kept them from getting 50% plus one, especially Purdue back in November. And then his mixed messaging regarding voting between November and the runoff in January also depressed Republican turnout. In that Trump, there was the mixed message of you can't, don't trust mail voting, the electoral system's rigged, so why bother? And since both Purdue, since both Republican candidates lost by narrow margins, it's reasonable to say that Trump probably, both through his lack of enthusiasm for the Republicans in the Georgia race, as well as his inconsistent mixed messaging about whether to vote or not, that he may have cost them that. And then I think just across the country, he was a drag. He's a drag on the ticket. He's especially a drag on the ticket in areas where working class or non-college educated Anglos are already voting Republican. So places like Arizona, Georgia, Texas. He may help Republicans somewhat in places like Minnesota, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio by bringing to the party working class Anglos who previously voted Democratic or didn't vote. But all those individuals were by and large voting Republican in the South and the Southwest. And so he doesn't bring anybody there. He tends to alienate more people and push them away. So the dilemma for Republicans is that he's there and he's not there. And so, that's one of the calculations that Republicans have with the removal proceedings in the Senate is how do they balance what is best for them in terms of their political career, their potential challenge in the primaries, and just overall support among the Republican base, where Donald Trump remains very popular, with what they believe is probably best for the Republican Party, that the specter of Donald Trump doesn't hang over them for the next 4 years as a potential 2024 candidate. And the one way they can get rid of Donald Trump's specter, or at least diminish it, is by at least a few of them, 17 of them, voting with the Democrats to remove him from office, and then letting the Democrats vote to ban him. that, and yeah, and then with the idea that then they may move past him. Of course, he still probably isn't going to go away, but he's a lot more damaging to Republicans as a legitimate primary candidate than he is as somebody who's been barred from seeking office in the future. In part because you'd have to say that, you know, if we were going to sort of game out the system and say who right now has the best odds of winning the 2024 Republican presidential nominating process or primaries, it would be Donald Trump. I mean, he still is very popular among Republicans, less popular than he was, but far more popular than anyone else. And he would be a tough rival to defeat in the 2024 primary, but he also then would be a candidate that would have a very difficult time winning the general election.
Thank you.
Dr. Jones, we have a question from Lisa Gregory. Lisa, you want to unmute yourself and ask the question?
Do you mean Julie?
Yes, sorry.
My question was if you had an explanation for why Trump improved his performance in the Valley, in those 3 counties that you showed in the data.
Okay, yeah, and he improved it across the Valley, but you know, Cameron, Hidalgo, and Webb are the 3 main population centers. But Zapata, Zavala, you know, he did well there also. It's tough to. I mean, there are several factors I think involved. One is from like a values perspective. South Texas is very conservative, so it's 90% Latino, but it's also quite socially conservative. And so some of Trump's messaging, especially on abortion, resonated. A second factor is a lot of the critiques of Trump in terms of systemic racism don't really have the same impact in the Valley because everyone in the Valley is Latino. That is, all the police officers are Latino, all the judges are Latinos, everyone's Latino. And so it tends to not resonate the same way it may do in a more sort of diverse setting like Houston or Dallas or Austin. And then a final one, I think, you know, probably what, you know, was the only real error Biden made during any of his debates was at the end of the second, where he effectively leveled with America about the future of transitioning away from energy, from fossil fuel energy towards renewables. That provided the Trump campaign with a really strong campaign message for certain areas of Texas, one of which is South Texas. So in the Valley, and in Laredo and Webb County, there are a large number of people that work in the oil and gas industry in the field. They either work in the Eagle Ford, which is in their backyards, or what's very common is they work out in the Permian. And those are very good paying jobs. I mean, so there are a lot of families in the Valley that depend on those jobs. So if you factor all those things together, plus the fact that Biden never really campaigned among Latinos or tried to win the Latino vote, you know, what was clear from Biden's campaign is he never developed a message specifically for Latinos. I think part of that's just Biden's worldview is a binary northern worldview where there are whites and African Americans. And he tends to, I think, approach his campaign towards Latinos just the same way we would do with African Americans. And that doesn't necessarily, that works on some issues, but it doesn't work on a lot of issues. And so that hurt him as well. It just not ever really making a major effort to try to win the Latino vote, which is different from, say, Hillary Clinton, who very explicitly, especially in the primary, but also in the general election, reached out to Latinos in a unique and direct way.
Lisa Berman, do you have a question for Dr. Jones?
Unmute. All right, so my question is regarding campaign finance. It seems like a lot of money pours into the state from outside interests. It seems like it's just a money arms race now. I mean, Georgia showed you that, as well as South Carolina in the Senate race there. So I was wondering, do you think there's a chance that campaign finance reform will ever happen, or are we just going to see the continuation of money just falling from the sky.
Well, I mean, I think it all goes back to the Citizens United ruling, which, and the Supreme Court, if anything, has gotten more conservative since Citizens United. And what that effectively does is it provides a loophole for any group to spend as much as they want in support of a candidate. So until that is addressed, you're probably not going to see too much in the way of real substantial reform, because you could adopt stricter reforms on the actual individual candidates, but at least, especially at the federal level, those rules are actually already pretty strict. That is, campaign donations are relatively limited, but it all is, it's all something of a farce when you can have those candidates limited to certain amounts of money, but then someone can create a super PAC and come in and spend $2 million on their behalf. Technically it's not coordinated, but it's coordinated. And so as a result, any restrictions you make will just really hurt the people who try to, follow the spirit of the rules. Now, we're one place where we could have more restrictions, though, is Texas. That is, Texas, we have we're a no limit state. That is, anyone can give it as much money as they want in Texas. And so as a result, we have donors. It's not uncommon for donors to give $500,000, $250,000, $1 million to individual candidates, levels at which you really have to say, that's probably getting into some dangerous territory. But I don't think there's any appetite on either side of the aisle in the Texas legislature to adopt any type of campaign finance reform. So unfortunately, I think we're just going to continue to see this expenditure of money. It's one of those things, though, when it's like an arms race in the sense that money cancels out money. So really, most of the data we have suggests that the money doesn't help you all that much, especially the better known you already are and the more higher profile the race is. But at the margins, you do have to match your rival at the risk of, if you don't, then you could lose, you may lose 1 or 2%, but that may be the difference in winning or losing the race. So I would expect it to continue. What we're starting to see, though, or at least what we saw this past election, is normally Texas had been an ATM for the rest of the country. And that we sent more money out than came into Texas. But starting in 2018 and then 2020, we saw a lot of money come from outside the state. And especially it came outside the state in 2020, focusing on the Texas House, because there was a strong national Democratic effort to try to flip the Texas House so that Democrats would have had a seat at the redistricting table and been able to block a partisan gerrymander of US House seats. Because Texas is going to have 38 or 39, depending on what the Senate shows. And if Texas Republicans had not been able to engage in a partisan gerrymander, that could have cost them 6, 7, 8 seats in 2022 and beyond. As things stand, Republicans are going to be able to engage in a pretty sophisticated partisan gerrymander. So I think many Democrats will look back to 2020 as a high watermark, in the sense that the districts were furthest removed from the 2011 redistricting, so that they were, so Republicans had ability to game the elections and manipulate the boundaries for their benefit, were at their lowest point. Plus, they had a very unpopular president at the top of the ticket. In 2022, position is going to be reversed. You're going to Republicans are going to have the ability to campaign against a national administration that likely will do things that alienate many Texans. We don't know, but that's generally the case. And they're going to be, the Texas House members, senators, and US House members are going to be able to compete from districts that are going to be tailor-made to benefit them, whereas Democrats are going to have to compete in those districts that were designed to make it as hard as possible for them to flip Republican-held seats.
Joyce, you said you had a follow-up question. It's Joyce. I don't know how to pronounce your last name. Oliwi.
Yeah, it's okay. It's Joyce Holloway. Hello, Dr. Jones. Good to see
Hi.
Oliwi.
Per what you had said concerning Biden's positioning for the high Latino populated areas, not having a very strong campaigning front there. Yet his executive orders that were signed within the first day in office favored many Latino populations. So is that not evidence of his concern for them, irrespective of what you call the binary North positioning?
Well, I think what I was talking about was more his campaign approach. His policies were always going to be, he had always said he was going to protect DACA, reverse a lot of the Trump immigration policies, protect TPS, but he never did a very good job campaigning. So it was really more the messaging rather than the actual policies. But if you don't do the messaging right, no one's going to bother to read your briefings. I've read the briefings, and it was always clear that he was going to do things that benefited immigrants, especially undocumented immigrants. But he never did a good job actually translating that message into real politics. And so, yeah, he got quite a bit of criticism, like Julian Castro in San Antonio, in Beto O'Rourke, not criticizing him for his policies, but more for his campaign style.
Thank you.
And Piper, you have a question.
I was hoping that you would explain how Mitch McConnell is holding up the Senate committee setups, even though he doesn't have the majority leadership anymore.
Well, we're in a situation where there's a tie, and Republicans do always have the filibuster option, at least for now. So it still behooves Chuck Schumer, the Democratic majority leader, to negotiate with McConnell so that Republicans don't engage in obstruction, and particularly for the cabinet confirmations. So that's one of the reasons why they came to an agreement to delay the Senate trial for a couple of weeks, in order to get Biden's cabinet members confirmed. It's the difficulty of Schumer's in the weakest position you can be and still be majority leader. That is, everything he does depends on having all the Democrats on board and having Kamala Harris cast the tie-breaking vote. And so and he knows that he doesn't want to get into a situation where he's going to be forced to do things on a 50-50 tie, Kamala Harris tiebreaker, because in the end, some of the Democratic moderates, like a Joe Manchin or the Kyrsten Sinema, made effect on him. So it's easier for him just to negotiate with McConnell and then be able to get things done, as opposed to running the risk of obstruction for a couple of weeks. And because in the end, the obstruction won't really hurt the Republicans, but it will upset the Biden administration and make it more difficult for Biden to begin governing if his appointees are all delayed. And so that's really McConnell's leverage, is to create sort of a mess and obstruct more than anything else.
Is that something that that the Senate rules can change? I mean, it feels like Mitch McConnell's been causing trouble by just obstructing for decades.
Well, the way they get around it would be to get rid of, the Senate can do anything by majority rule. So you could pass rules, get rid of the filibuster. But the reality is moderate Democrats don't really want to do that, because one, they often are closer to some of their moderate Republican colleagues than they are to their more liberal Democratic colleagues. And then also, their power is a little greater, or at least they're more comfortable with a Senate that retains that sort of consensual mechanism that is the filibuster, as opposed to going to the more majoritarian position like the House has. So they could. It's certainly under the Senate rules. If Mitch McConnell wanted to move to a very majoritarian system, which is the House is, you have a majority by one seat in the House, you can do whatever you want. The Senate traditionally has not worked that way. But if Democrats wanted to move it that way, they could. But it would require every Democrat to agree, all 50 of them. And I don't think Schumer has that level of agreement right now.
And Julie, you have a question.
Yes, Dr. Jones, how do you think Ted Cruz fared in his maneuvers up to and including January 6th. Has he helped himself in Texas or hurt himself?
Well, I mean, I think Ted Cruz is really thinking national as opposed to Texas. So everything Ted Cruz has been doing is oriented towards the 2024 presidential bid. I think his reelection for Texas in 2024 is something I don't think he would. I think his preference would be to run for Senate. I mean, run for president and just leave Texas and the Senate behind. It was working out well for him until the storming of the Capitol on January 6th, because in the end, if Donald Trump's not the candidate, he's still going to be very popular among many Republican primary voters. And Cruz's hope was to be able to gain as much of their support as possible by presenting himself as one of Trump's most ardent supporters in the Senate, fighting hard to block certification of the results, even though Cruz knows full well that there were no problems with the results, and in the end, his gambit was going to fail. But it was more political theater designed to convince Trump supporters that Ted Cruz supported their guy and had Trump's back, whereas other Republicans did not. It blew up in his face somewhat with the storming of the Capitol and the violence that ensued. Whether it hurt him or not, it probably didn't hurt him all that much to win the Republican primary still, or at least it probably hurt him a little bit, but not a huge amount. It may, though, make him much less electable in a general election, which then could undermine his support in the Republican primary by more strategic Republicans who are more interested in, not so much concerned with the ideological bona fides of the candidate. They want to choose the candidate who gives them the best hope of defeating their Democratic rival. So it probably hurt. I would say it hurt him overall. So but it only hurt him probably because of the riots and the inciting of violence and the storming of the Capitol on January 6th. Had that not occurred, it probably would have helped him for the Republican primary, and the blowback for November of 2024 would have been lower. Now, though, I think he's in a much more difficult position, and many of his Democratic Senate colleagues are not going to let it go, and they're calling for an ethics investigation. So I would suspect that at least for the next year or so, he's going to get quite a bit of heat. But by 2024, it may all have blown over.
Well, that would be my follow-up, Dr. Jones. I have listened to news reports of people saying that there should be accountability, not just for former President Trump, but also for the senators and congressmen who also pushed forward the big lie about election fraud. But how likely do you think there is going to be any accountability or consequences for those senators and congressmen?
Well, the accountability will occur in 2022 for at least the U.S. House members. They're all up for re-election, but a lot will depend on the redistricting. And so what we've seen in Texas is we have 23 Republican districts. Our 22 districts are held by Republicans, 13 by Democrats. We're going to get 2 or 3 more, but Republicans are going to be completely in control of the redistricting process. So odds are, with a couple of exceptions, most of those Republicans won't have to worry about November voters in 2024 because they're going to be in relatively safe Republican districts. Now, it's going to be tough for all of them to be in safe districts. So, maybe Beth Van Dyne up in Dallas, or, could be Troy Nales or Dan Crenshaw here in Houston. Maybe they aren't in the safest of districts, but odds are most of them will be in pretty safe districts.
Well, we have about time for one more quick question. Does anybody want to throw in, raise your hand and ask a question? I can only see the people who, of course, are on camera. If you'd like anybody, I'm going to the other screen. Anybody want to ask a question? Okay, well, we're almost to the end of our hour in any case. And Dr. Jones, I can't thank you enough. You have generously shared your time with us in election years to come in and talk to us about election issues, and we all very much appreciate that.
No, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
I'd like to remind everybody online that our next speaker, next Monday, same time, same place, is Dr. Eduardo Salas, who'll be joined by one of his graduate or postdoc, I'm not sure which fellows, Allison Traylor, and they're going to speak on how teamwork on projects, engineering, fosters or hinders women in STEM careers? So that's a question we're all interested in as Rice graduates. And I would also finally like to thank again the Alumni Office for the support they offer to our programs by jetting up these Zoom meetings, not to mentioning handling our registration process. We just couldn't do this without the Alumni Office. So Carrie, once again, really, we appreciate you. And finally, to all of you, I saw we were up to 54 attendees at points. I can tell you 54 attendees is probably double what we have at a usual in-person meeting on campus. So we are this year, despite COVID, one of the good things is that we're able to have these programs available to more of you. And we do appreciate your taking an hour out of your day and joining us. And just because I think we might have the highest percentage of men ever at one of the meetings, and you're all welcome to join. We love having anybody join our group. Doesn't even have to be a Rice graduate. We'll take just about anyone who's interested in our topics. So thank you all for tuning in. Big, big thanks to Dr. Jones.